Star blessings. Let's talk about transiting Venus at the moment relative to Saturn, Pluto, and the goddess Lilith. And I'm going to bring up a controversial subject. And I feel like I should have played Prince's song Controversy as I started this video. It is a controversial subject, and I'm not here to give a personal opinion. I'm just here to speak to the astrology and really for the purposes of us all to hopefully reflect, detach, and be able to view things from all sides as well. And so obviously I'm referring to the Dalai Lama. Today's focus, I don't really want it to be on that. I want it to be more on the aspect between Venus, Saturn, Pluto, and Lilith, because it's quite an extraordinary pattern going on at the moment. But here's the thing, the current transits are mirroring so much of the Dalai Lama's own chart at the moment, right? So there's a few things there, and I'm not going to go into a delineation of his whole chart and the whole story and all of that. But I do want to highlight a couple of things. I did create a post that I think some of you have seen on my YouTube channel and other social media, and I've outlined more than 20 things that are activating his chart at the moment, right? And they're not minor things. They're all really big things, really big things. So his chart is pulsating. It's lighting up like a Christmas tree at the moment, you know, for better or for worse. And the solar eclipse that's coming up in Aries just in a few days' time is massive relative to what it's hitting off in his chart. And solar eclipses do tend to be more difficult, right, and challenging, and bring up things that were hidden, unconscious, you know, and so forth. So, well, first of all, let me just share my screen and let's just bring up the chart. So here's the focus of today, really. It's Venus in Gemini, which forms a square to Saturn in Pisces. She forms a trine to Pluto. She forms a square to Lilith. And so there's actually a T-square between Saturn being opposite Lilith and then Venus being, you know, in the middle of those two, squaring them, right? That's called a T-square. And Pluto is forming a trine to Venus, or Venus is forming a trine to Pluto. She's past it, but it's still there. And then, of course, I've left the nodes in because I think this is quite significant too, relative to this picture. The South Node in Scorpio, Venus forms an inconjunct or a quincunx. Those two terms refer to the same aspect, which is 150 degrees. So Venus is wide activated with some pretty challenging archetypal energy at the moment. Now, the interesting thing is that in the Dalai Lama's chart, he has Lilith in Virgo, and he has Lilith in Virgo opposite Saturn in his chart. So this exact transit that's playing out in the heavens at the moment is a direct mirror of his own chart, an aspect in his own chart. So I want to talk a little bit about Lilith because she doesn't get spoken about a lot, and often the projected perspective on Lilith is quite dark, and she's been often demonized as this dark devil, archetypal feminine energy that a lot of people feel uncomfortable about. So for those of us that are a little bit more in tune, a little bit more awake, a little bit more in touch with our own dark elements and components, we appreciate the Lilith archetype, I think, from a different perspective, right? I heard this guy saying the other day, which I thought was really, really an interesting perception. I can't regurgitate word for word what he said, but basically what he was saying was that the dark elements and the shadow qualities within human beings, from a creative perspective, are extremely powerful. when an artist tunes into those darker forces, they produce extraordinary creativity. And think about that. I think that's a very valid statement, actually. And Lilith, of course, is that darker component to our raw emotionality, right? Which has been, suppressed and ordered and structured and told to be a particular way, which just goes back to the story of Lilith, which is she wasn't interested in conforming, in being submissive. She either wanted to be equal or just be free. That's that in a nutshell. Those are the principles of the archetype of Lilith. So for someone who has a strong Lilith in their chart, they can really activate people, really upset and piss people off, because they tend to be more in touch with their own raw emotionality and are more fearless about expressing that, right? And allowing others to express that as well. The opposite to that, of course, is fearing that and trying to suppress it in ourselves or others, and projecting the Lilith archetype onto others and seeing them as radical or unpredictable or uncontrollable. And they are, right? And so based on one's values and morals and upbringing and perceptions and so forth and judgments, that will color, of course, how they see the Lilith archetype in others and how they experience it themselves. So in the Dalai Lama's chart, here's his chart here, and this is not a rectified time, but it is a time that comes from his mother's memory. So we can say that it's probably close to this time. Okay, it might not be exact, but it's reasonably close. And all the things that are happening in his chart that I mentioned, which is like over 20 different things, are not so much dependent on the accuracy of the time of birth, which is fortunate from the point of view of being able to point to very specific, significant and powerful transits, eclipses. I've spoken about his Fidario periods, Venus star points. All those levels are activating things in his chart, big time. So it's not a surprise to me at all that this drama has broken out, right, in the world about him and about the event and everyone's perception on it. And there is a clear division of where people sit with that. I've seen the most extreme, harsh judgment, which is definitely his Lilith opposite Saturn, right? Virgo Pisces, which is a current transit in the sky at the moment, as I just showed you in the other chart. And then I've seen a more empathetic, compassionate and understanding side, and a side that is inviting people to open their minds and have more understanding about the customs and cultures in the Tibetan stream, and the way in which they greet each other and things of that nature. There's a lot of different norms and customs and cultures throughout, so many different countries, religions and nationalities and so forth. And we're not familiar with all of them, and we don't understand all of them. And we certainly probably don't accept all of them. And that's up to each of us. But at the same time, before we cast stones, I love that biblical quote, which I've just forgotten exactly how it goes, but it's that line about, before you cast your stones on others, better check in with your own, with your own self, how innocent and perfect and pure and righteous are you, right? So we're very quick to to throw stones on people and throw them under the bus. We're very quick to judge. And Lilith in Virgo is no exception to this particular approach and activation at the moment in the collective unconscious. And because his chart is being activated by so many different things, it's going to, come under the microscope, as it were. So once again, I'm not here to speak about my personal perspective on it. I like to maintain an objective, professional approach to things and just speak to the astrology. So I might start actually with Lilith, some comments about Lilith in Virgo, which are worth considering at the moment, given that transiting Lilith is in Virgo. And this may be your natal position. It is the Dalai Lama's natal position. And as you can see, Lilith is currently, opposing Saturn. And once again, that's the exact same configuration he has in his own chart. So these are just some general comments about the archetype of Lilith as expressed through the archetype of Virgo. And so I'm reading from Tom Jacobs, Lilith Healing the Wild. It's a pretty good book, actually. I think he's done a great job with this book. Planets working through Virgo's lens seek to break down holes into constituent parts in order to learn how to improve them, recognizing that detail-oriented work is the only way to make things better. Analytical is a word we ascribe to Virgo, yet it is important to remember that Virgo's bottom line is in making things better, in serving in some specific way. With Lilith in Virgo, all the natural ways of a person approaches the method of Virgo will carry the judgments of others. Keep these comments in mind, knowing that we have this transit in the sky at the moment, and the Dalai Lama has the exact configuration in his own chart. Keep these comments in mind. Someone with this placement will be criticized and punished for how he or she chooses to serve others, whether it's the kind of service that's deemed appropriate or the way he or she reacts to the notion. As a sign of service, Virgo includes any relationships we have that are based on the imbalance of power. Teacher-student, craftsman-apprenticeship, master-slave relationships fit in here. Virgo is also a sign of caring for those less fortunate, of nursing and caring for the sick. The person with Lilith in this sign might be more attuned to finding the Lilith in others that needs attention, or might be reactionary to the idea of serving anyone at all. With Lilith here being an indicator that service might have been experienced as a punishment in the past, with it now viewed by the person with disdain. In relationships where there is an imbalance of power, the Lilith in Virgo person can draw extreme shame from the fact of serving. Shame is the reason he's often referring to the term shame is because it's an archetypal expression of what comes up with the archetype of Lilith based on her energy, her story, and the suppression of that part of the feminine, which has existed for thousands of years. Okay, those the person serves and is served by can tap into the energy of Lilith in the person, and if judgment and shame from others have been internalized by the native, those served and serving can reflect it to the Lilith in Virgo native. Think about those comments, right? Healthy Virgo energy involves the development of humility, and unhealthy Virgo can find itself humiliated. And there is a profound difference between the two experiences. If Lilith is hiding in the individual, others may seem to rush in to participate in shaming the native for his or her Virgo-inspired qualities and behaviors. The person in this situation needs to turn his or her Lilith energy and reconnect personally outside the confines of unhealthy relationships. Authentic attention to his or her body as an instrument of the world. He just goes on. I'm not going to read the rest of that. There's just some comments about health, the body, eating, diet, and things like that, because that's obviously a theme of the archetype of Virgo. When Lilith is not hidden, a person's relationship with his or her body will be informed by a visceral understanding of cause and effect. This kind of relationship is not common in our culture. It may be the source of criticism or fear from others when Lilith in Virgo is fully expressed about what the body is and does and what it wants and needs to maintain a state of health. That's just further comments about health and the body. The underlying energy of Virgo is to make things better. Healing for those with Lilith placement includes releasing any internalized judgment from others that has been taken on and learning without a doubt that remaining connected with the wild, irrational side is in truth a service. It is from this place that the person will connect with his or her particular method of service, yet it is also for others a form of service to bring this wild into the world, especially when it comes to the knowledge from experience the Lilith in Virgo person can have and share about connecting to the physical body as an instrument or extension of the wild in the world. Now, I just want to read one more thing, and then I'm going to unpack some further matters about the Venus, Saturn, Pluto nodes. Just some comments about Saturn and Lilith, right? The energy of that. Now, this is a really interesting configuration, and especially because he has it in his own chart and it is a current transit, because Virgo can really be animated and activated with matters of guilt and shame, judgment, and certainly Saturn brings up those themes as well. So we've got a double signature, Virgo, Saturn, that are in a, Saturn and Lilith are in an opposition. So there's a face-off, right? There's a clear division, okay? There's one side of the fence is here and the other side is sitting over here. It's a polarization, right? And oppositions can be really challenging from that perspective because people are projecting things onto each other. And the ultimate resolution, of course, is to, and this is why oppositions are so powerful and can produce amazing objectivity and awareness and clarity, but it takes time because the initial response and reaction to an opposition is to claim one position and project the other, right? And so in both ends of this spectrum, we have themes around judgment very, very prominent through these archetypes. And of course, Saturn, which is an archetype that corresponds to this time-space reality and our conscious construct of this reality, is largely connected to suppression, limitation, fear, judgment, separation, cruelty, limits, nothing to do with freedom. If somebody asked you, you know, what's the energy in the chart, which archetype would you ascribe to freedom? You'd never say Saturn, would you? You'd go straight to Uranus, okay? So Saturn is everything that restrains and restricts freedom. But Saturn has its purpose, its usefulness, and its richness in growth, maturity, and development as well. It's not to shame or bash Saturn because it's a necessary archetype. But at the real extreme end of the spectrum, Saturn can be so suffocating and so judgmental and so limiting, right? And so it just depends on how we integrate the Saturnian archetype within us in terms of how we subsequently experience the realm of Saturn and how much we project the Saturnian archetype around us, right? It all always comes back to our own self, right? And how aware we are, how integrated we are, how honest we are as well. So Saturn-Lilith combo is not easy at all, because they are two opposing archetypes, as I was just saying with Saturn. Lilith is the archetype that speaks to freedom. It's the wild feminine that you can't control. And that activates people, that triggers people, that pisses people off, it scares people. Lilith has dark components from the point of view of when that frequency, that portal, is not integrated in a healthy way. It's projected all around us, and it is very dysfunctional. It's a very dysfunctional archetype when it's not integrated and projected, and definitely comes up in matters of abuse of power, abuse in various forms, right? But at the heart and essence of Lilith is an untamed, wild feminine expression that has just been suppressed for a very long time, very simply put. So Saturn is kind of, it's you know, in a face-off with Lilith at the moment, as it were, right? So Saturn is the planet of structure, maturity, authority, discipline, delayed gratification, and work. Where it is our natal chart, where it is in our natal chart, shows us where we have to work to do in this life, to figure out how to develop healthy expression of the above ideas. As the planet associated with society is put together, Saturn also relates to conditioning, how we have been formed into productive members of any groups to which we've belonged at times in our lives, family, school, religious organizations, nations, etc., etc., etc. And the word condition is really the key word here, because Saturn is it describes our conditioned state, mental state, our conditioned imprints from this life and from every other life as well. Lilith in aspect to Saturn creates a conversation between the raw, primal, irrational, and instinctive side of us and this heavy planet, Saturn, the planet of structure, restriction, and limitation. Much will depend on the aspect and the signs. He's just talking about if you've got a Lilith-Saturn configuration on your chart, obviously the signs, the houses, and the aspects between Lilith and Saturn are going to give you the details of the story of those two archetypes and what they mean for you. Much will depend on okay, the general Lilith-inspired expression. The conversation between them is about what kind of Lilith-inspired expression is acceptable and what part, if any, will be permitted. That's really interesting, you know, which expression is acceptable and what's permitted. See, Saturn is the one that defines and dictates those terms when we live completely through Saturn reality. That's what we experience. That's what we feel. We feel, oh, I couldn't express those emotions. I couldn't express those feelings because they won't be accepted by them, by him, by her, right? So there's this sense of holding back and fear and shame of really bringing out what you actually feel for the reason that you will be judged, ridiculed, excluded if you do, right? So there's this sense of restrainment, which is Saturn. When we restrain ourselves, that's when we are feeling Saturn's energy, as it were, right? And there's a healthy level of restrainment for sure. And then there's a very unhealthy level, which is basically complete repression and suppression, which leads to depression, They're the three pressions of Saturn: suppression, oppression, depression. As the archetype of social order, Saturn is the archetype most opposed to Lilith. Of course it is. I've just explained that in the last few minutes. People behaving precisely how they're viscerally guided in any moment is the single biggest threat to the law and order Saturn aims to build and maintain, claims as well. Consequently, people with an aspect between these two energies will seem to struggle more than most to find out who Lilith is and how to honor her as part of the self. The level of struggling will be tied up in the degree of which the individual has taken on the judgments of others about him or herself for carrying Lilith's energy. Whatever the aspect, the conversation between these two energies can seem a personal, microcosmic summit in one of our culture's most important questions. What is the place of the primal in us? I'm not down on Saturnian energy or what it aims to do or does do, but as individuals and then as a collective need to learn that Saturnian energy isn't all there is. And I wholeheartedly concur to that. The answer to Saturn traditionally is Uranus. Of course it is. The planet of freedom and the breaking of limitations. Yet at this stage in our collective evolution, Uranus isn't the only answer. Uranus as the liberator is the anti-Saturn. And I view Lilith as an equally important energy to cultivate, reflecting that if we are not connected to ourselves as nature, we will not connect meaningfully and personally with the need to take better care of ourselves and the planet. An important note is that Uranus is a mental planet and Lilith connects us to the physical world. As the archetype of the authority figure, Saturn also correlates to the part of our parenting. A Lilith-Saturn aspect could indicate a specific parent or parental figure in an individual's life and relationships with authority figures in general. The person could have a history of being judged and punished by Saturnian types at home, school, work, elsewhere. There are two extreme results to such treatment: learning that Lilith is bad and stuffing the energy to where it gets to airtime, and exploding with irrational, instinctive rage in rebellion against attempts at suppression. If the response is to get quiet to avoid punishment, the individual can develop into someone feeling less than fully alive. If the other response is chosen, the individual runs the risk of being severely punished for transgressing the rules and the status quo. There's more, but I'll just leave the rest there. So those of you that are Lilith fans, this is a great book to invest in. So here we have transiting Lilith square Venus, opposite Saturn, and Pluto trine Venus, and Venus in conjunct the South Node. Keeping all these things in mind with Lilith in Virgo at the moment, there is definitely some, dynamic, tension-provoking energies with these configurations at the moment. The interesting thing is that the conjunction between Saturn and Venus the last conjunction occurred in January in Aquarius, right? So this is a first quarter square, right, to Saturn and Venus being in a square aspect at the moment. And Saturn in Aquarius was there for 2.5 years. So Venus had a couple of cycles of forming a conjunction to Saturn. But the reason this first quarter square is quite unique at the moment is because Pluto recently ingressing into